Okay, right. So this is sped up to this is sped up twice. Basically, this is 2 times as fast as it actually was, and I'm just going to talk through what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. I'm using Blender to block out the initial 3D forms, even though these 3D forms are extremely simple and straightforward. I'm doing it in Blender. You could do it in 3D Coat as well, because you can make freeform cubes. I'm just using Blender here because I'm just a bit quicker when I'm generating these primitive forms in how I move them about, and I just feel that it also is a good excuse to show off how you can build something in Blender or any 3D app, bring it into 3D Coat, and then do sculptural modeling over the top of it, voxel modeling. What I'm doing here though is I'm taking each of those forms and I'm booleaning them together, because it is quite important that you have a mesh that's completely enclosed. And I'm using the Bool Tools plugin, which comes with Blender. I'm just switching it on. I select one object, then another, and then hold Control and then plus on the number pad, and that will boolean them together, creating me a kind of completely hollow but solid mesh with nothing happening inside of it. Once I've done that, I'll save it out as an OBJ, and when you save something out in Blender for the first time as an OBJ, you have to make sure you put selection only. Then I start a new voxel modeling session and choose a little folder icon to select the model. It'll normally come in too small, so just scale it up and then go apply, and it'll say, do you want to preserve the kind of preserve the sort of scaling and translation and rotation? And you go yes. Basically this means you can scale it up in 3D Coat, do what you like to it, and then when you export it, it will export out at the same scale as you originally brought it in, which is really, really useful. Also, another thing, when you import it and as you scale it up, it will give you an estimated final triangle size. And remember, in 3D Coat, the bigger the object is in 3D Coat, the more triangles, the more resolution it will actually have. It does make a difference. So you don't want it too small, otherwise you won't be able to put much detail in unless you increase the resolution of it separately. At the same time, you don't want to make it too big, otherwise you can have an extremely high resolution mesh. I'm going for about, I think it's between 1.5 and 2 million triangles. To be honest, I could probably have gone a little bit higher for this. It would have enabled me to get some more detail in. 3D Coat can handle a lot of detail. What I'm doing here now, so I'm actually doing the modeling now. This is the sort of stuff that you could do in Maya, you could do in Blender as polygonal modeling, but it's so much easier to do in 3D Coat. I'm using the Pose tool to add a series of extrusions and indentations around the object. Press spacebar, that brings up the tool selection. Select the Pose tool. Make sure that Ignore Back Faces is off, and then draw rectangle selections on, and then just draw a bunch of selections and then scale in and out. It's as simple as that. Now I'm using Symmetry tool and Vox Hide. Vox Hide is a super useful tool. It will hide bits of your model, but then by holding Control, it will bring some of them back. And you can create really difficult, tricky to make geometry using this kind of combination of hiding stuff and then bringing it back. I'm not actually creating particularly difficult geometry here, to be honest. I'm only scratching the surface of what you can potentially do with it. But yeah, Vox Hide is a super, super useful tool. I'm kind of running into the limitations actually here now of the resolution of my original object. I can't quite get the detail that I want. In an ideal world, I would have resampled it and added some more resolution into it. But at the same time, I'm just kind of treating this as a sketch, a 3D sketch, rather than anything kind of final. Notice that when you hide stuff and unhide stuff, it's view angle dependent. So it's kind of like it projects from your point of view. And that's why I kind of tilt up if I want to get a more sort of slanted edge to stuff. The next thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to add in some extra little details here. Well, I mess around here and I'm not too happy with any of the things I kind of do. So I end up using the Pose tool to try and do almost the same kind of thing. What I'll mention here is the idea for the shape of this object didn't just come up. I didn't just come up with it off the top of my own head. I was watching a video about one of those kind of ASMR relaxation, but also kind of interesting walking tour kind of videos of Freiburg, which is a sort of town, city in Germany. And they have a really cool looking library. And I just really dug the shape of the library, which was a sort of, with these kind of two or three kind of trapezoids, sort of one on top of each other, but sort of flipped around. And I thought it made a really nice kind of interesting shape. And I thought, I think you could make a sort of sci-fi, almost grimdark sci-fi kind of building based on that kind of idea. So I just remembered it. In this case, I didn't have a picture of it up on the other screen. When I was watching this video, I thought, that's an interesting shape. So I will remember. It should be easy to remember. Two or three trapezoids flipping, sort of one up, one down, one up, and overlapping on top of each other. And if I get that kind of base shape down, it will give me an interesting sort of base shape, and then I can sort of sketch ideas over the top of it, which is mostly a series of figuring out where little extrusions are going to happen, where little sort of indentations are going to happen, and where I'm going to put details. Most of the time I'm working in orthographic mode, because that means that doing all of these extrusions, because it's projected from your viewpoint, is a little bit more predictable. But every once in a while I'll switch back to perspective mode to give me a feel for actually how big the object kind of feels. Back into orthographic mode, I'm going to start using some stencils now to kind of put the greebles, put the details over the top. Details almost for free, to be honest. I switched to vertex normal direction, and I use these stencils in combination with the extrusion function. These stencils, I didn't make these stencils. These stencils I got for free off of a map painter and concept artist called Wayne Haag. He's an Australian bloke, and he didn't make these stencils either. He used to work for Digital Domain, which was a VFX company, and they have the original patterns used in the first Blade Runner film. These patterns were used to acid etch metal details into those big, ginormous kind of Tyrell Corporation, megacity kind of buildings. But they've still got them. They've got them at Digital Domain, and they're free. They gave them to Wayne Haag, and he's made them freely available on his website for $0. And it's quite nice. They've some very nice techie kind of panel-y kind of details. And I'm old enough and nerdy enough that I do still quite like the first Blade Runner film, and I thought it'd be nice to put it on here. It doesn't really give it a Blade Runner-y kind of feel, in my opinion, although I guess there is a sort of trapezoidal pyramid kind of shape to the first Tyrell building. To me, it gives it, the way I'm kind of applying it all over my building, it gives it a bit more of a almost fantasy kind of sci-fi look to it. As I mentioned, a sort of a grimdarky kind of feel. Maybe something that would appear more in something like, I don't know, Dune or Warhammer 40k or something like that. Not that I'm particularly knowledgeable about Warhammer 40k, but I know that it's got like a almost sort of silly, over the top, kind of dark kind of vibe to it. But you can see what happens, how you just get all this detail for free instantly. When I'm using the symmetry mode, I can just have it as well, apply it to one side, and it will automatically happen to the other side. I want to sort of, the stencil stuff obviously gives me that kind of detail for free, but I also want to decide where I want to put certain panel kind of details as well. So I'll mix and match it. I'll use stencils and extrusions, but then I'll also use the polygonal lasso tool with extrusions as well to kind of user define exactly where and what shape panels I want to have. I'm going for a door, kind of entrance now. This is really much more of a first pass kind of sketch kind of idea for this kind of thing. When I finish this, it's not really what I wanted, to be honest. I was not particularly satisfied with it as a design. I still like the idea of using these sort of trapezoid kind of patterns, but I want to make something that feels a lot bigger. I ended up making this door's far too big. By making the door really big, it makes the rest of the building feel really small. But again, that's just something that I will bear in mind when I have another go at kind of doing it. Got to get the bad ideas out. It's just like drawing, just like painting. Similar thing with 3D, because 3D Coat is such a sort of quick, intuitive way of doing 3D, where you're not worrying about polygons or anything kind of like that. You're not worried about topology. It's even quicker in some ways and even more freeing and freestyle than something like ZBrush is. So I just treat it like a 3D sketching kind of tool. That, to be honest though, I could end up, and I have ended up using 3D Coat to do more final kind of assets after I've gone past the sketching stage of it. So I'm kind of using the pose tool there to indent a door, and then also using the pose tool to sort of create patterns or frames around the door. And then using the extruder tool again and the polygonal lasso tool to kind of create panels and details around that kind of door. I don't want tons and tons of detail to be absolutely everywhere. I mean, I quite like what happens on these kind of building kind of structures when there is a decent amount of detail in certain areas. Adds a sense of scale. I think there's something quite pleasing about the complexity of it, especially when it starts catching light. And I bring this into Substance Painter later to put some quick textures on it. And having that geometric detail built into the object just works so well with Substance Painter, because when Substance Painter does its initial analysis of the mesh and builds up the ambient occlusion, the thickness and the curvature kind of maps, it has all of that stuff, has all of that mesh is physically there, so it can generate those maps. You could use those stencils, those Blade Runner stencils or any stencils, as a displacement map in something like Blender or Maya or whatever, and that would work too. And you would end up with a much lighter 3D mesh. But you can't. The problem with displacement maps is you can't see them until you hit render. They're invisible in the viewport, and something like Substance Painter can't see them either, because Substance Painter needs geometric mesh information to generate that kind of stuff. So yeah, again, using a bit of the extrude tool with symmetry just to create some panels and shapes on the back of this building. You see the sort of indented line about halfway up the building. I always think those little details are quite important for breaking up larger areas. Something that the old concept artist designer Ralph McQuarrie did lots of in Star Wars. But it's just a tried and trusted design technique to break up kind of flat areas, but not overload them with detail. And then I like to sort of add a little sort of support areas, I suppose you could call them greeble kind of details, but I think greebles are more like mindless details. When I'm putting in those little vertical strips that connect up that indented area, that's not really mindless. I'm putting them there for a reason, and that's to sort of bridge the upper part of the model with the bottom part of the model. Forgot that I had ignore back faces on, so my little extrusion detail wasn't going through the entire model, but now it is. Yeah, but I think I'm probably going to check it in. I'm going to add a little bit of detail here, and then in a moment I'm going to check it in perspective, see how it feels in perspective. Does it feel kind of big? As I mentioned, by having that door be quite big, to me it no longer feels like a big building with a door like that. It feels more like a, I don't know, a sort of utility kind of hut or something like that in a sci-fi kind of game. Not sure what you would store there. So yeah, checking it out in perspective mode now. Back into orthographic just to do a final little bit of panel work. So you can see it's the bottom left and right side I held down control, so most of the panels are going outwards, but by holding control, remember, the opposite happens and the extrusion will go inwards. Again, stuff that is just a walk in the park to do in 3D Coat, because I don't have to worry about topology. You don't have to worry about, oh, what's going to happen when I hit smooth or anything like that. So I think I'm about happy now with, or happy-ish anyway, for a first pass. So I'm going to export it. I'm going to overwrite my initial base mesh from Blender. And 3D Coat's going to think I'm going to put 85% polygon reduction. This will drastically reduce the density of the mesh, but without losing any detail. And because I initially said preserve translation, it means I can load it in and it will be, I'll load it back into Blender and it will be exactly the same position and the same scale, which is very, very handy. There we go. So I'm going to create a quick plane and throw a sort of shiny metallic reflective kind of material on that, just so it kind of reflects. My building reflects on the ground, not for any particular reason other than I just like the way it looks. I'm going to switch to Cycles and GPU Renderer, and I'm going to activate the HDRI Gaffer plugin. Now, Gaffer is a paid plugin for Blender. It's not very expensive though, but it's a very useful plugin. It allows you to see the HDRIs that you're going to put into the environment to light your scene in a super user-friendly way. You can rotate it all without going into the shader editor. And you can automatically download the HDRIs from Blender from HDRI Haven for free, which is awesome. And Gaffer also, that's just one thing that Gaffer does. Gaffer also manages your lights. It manages your lights in the system in a very useful way. So I really recommend buying Gaffer. Okay, now we're going to texture it in Substance Painter. Remember, you can get Substance Painter for free as a student. If you're watching this on YouTube, I guess you can't get it for free unless you're a student. But if you are a student, it is definitely worthwhile getting it. And I'm thinking, well, what can I do to just... I'm kind of committed to this slightly grimy, grimdarky kind of look. So I want a bashed up, scuffed metal kind of look. So I'm going to throw a combination of smart materials that come with Substance, normal base materials that come with Substance, and also a couple of base materials that I downloaded off of Substance Share for free. Anything, I'm just going to see what it looks like. You know, I've baked the mesh maps, so it just doesn't hurt to just throw a bunch of stuff on and see how it feels and how it looks. Again, because I'm just treating this as a kind of more of a sketch rather than a finished kind of thing. If I was going to go through and then take this to a more polished final kind of piece, I would probably spend a lot more time in Substance. Now, if you're a concept-y kind of person, you don't have to do this stuff in Substance. This is another level of more kind of pure 3D way of tackling things that might not jive with the way that you like to work, and that's cool. You could do exactly the same thing using photo textures in Photoshop, or you could just find some preset materials for Blender and throw them on directly in Blender. I find Substance Painter very quick and intuitive to use. I just treat it like a material version of Photoshop. So I like to just layer up a bunch of stuff on top of each other. And then I think that when you do a base render, in Blender or Maya, or whatever you want to use, you just get so much beautiful stuff happening with very little effort. So what I like to do is I put smart material on, and I like to add in an extra level of roughness kind of variations. So I'm a big believer in just throwing down a fill layer that only affects roughness, applying a mask, and then applying a fill to that mask, and then putting a grunge texture into that fill. That enables me then to go back into the roughness part and just tweak the roughness slider to get that kind of level of shininess versus unshininess, or shininess versus roughness that I want. I'm toying with the idea here of making the door a different material. Well, I do more than toy with it. I commit myself to doing that. But first things first, I put everything in a group, and I think, well, actually it might have already been in a group, and I get rid of the stuff I don't want. And then I go for this new smart material. Again, it comes with substance. I apply a black mask to it in a group, and then paint to that black mask. And with the hard round brush, my colleague Joe would approve, I'm just going to use Shift. Just like Photoshop, you can hold down Shift to draw straight lines. And I'm going to mask it. I'm going to create a white mask where the door is, so that any material in that folder is going to only show through where there's white in the mask. So fairly straightforward way of doing it. Again, it's concept modeling, so I don't have to be particularly accurate, because if I was going to bring this into Photoshop, I'd be painting over the top of it anyway at the end. I end up getting rid of most of the rust and the dirt components of that machinery, worn machinery kind of smart material, and change the color. I end up with something which almost the same as the main material, but I think that it kind of adds a slightly interesting variance to it. You know, we're not looking at just one smart material over everything. Now that I've created that mask as well, means I can see what it looks like if I put in something else in. So I put in this carbon fiber material, play around with that because I thought potentially that would look good, but I decided against it. Can't quite make it look good without making it just look too busy, too annoying. So I figure eventually it's just a slightly different shade of grey with a slightly different sort of set of roughness is the thing that makes it look good. And I switched the worn machinery kind of material back on, and then tweak the roughness, tweak the rust and dirt kind of settings. It's all nicely broken up. If you open up that smart material, you'll see all the different layers on top of each other, and you can go in to the mask settings. That might be something that will catch you out if you don't know, if you're not that used to the way Substance Painter works. Nearly everything is controlled by masks, not the actual material itself. It's kind of like, consider it that the material is where you define the overall look of the colors and the shininess and the roughness, and the masks are how you control where that stuff gets put. It sounds self-evident when I'm saying it now to myself, but I think a lot of people don't realize that you've got to go into the mask settings, and then you'll see like the mask editors or mask builders, and then that'll be where you'll tweak the slider to decide how rusty you want it to look, how dirty you want it to look, how dusty, kind of, etc. Yeah, so I end up with something that looks a little bit like that. And I think that's about all I'm going to do with it. Again, if I was going to take this further, I'd put decals on and stuff like that. Oh, I know what I do now. Yeah, I put a little bit extra sort of dirt that's going to go all around the base of the object. So I'm using a rust base material here, and I put that on top, and I stop it from looking like rust. And then I'm going to find a mask, a smart mask, that's going to go from the ground up, like ground dirt, I think that is, or ground rust or something like that. That's going to give me a mask that just automatically creates white near the bottom and fades off. And I'm going to turn off the other grunge layers or minimize them until I only have this kind of gradient that sits around the base of the object. And my rust is pretty much the same colour, it's just a slightly different shade of grey again. I think I play around with different kind of colours here. But this is another thing that you should kind of always bear in mind, I think, when you're doing any kind of building asset, is that you want some kind of colour difference where the base of the building hits the ground. Because more dirt and more dust and more moss, etc. will build up there over time. And it's touches like that, I think, make subtle little differences. Right, I'm exporting the textures now to Blender. I've made my own Blender preset. One thing I've noticed here is that it's all saving 8-bit out, so I'm going to change the export settings so that it respects my presets, which gives me 16-bit normal maps. Not a deal breaker, but it can give you a little bit of extra quality. I don't think, to be honest, you'll ever notice it. Not when you're doing concept stuff, not when you're going to be painting over the top. But I think it was just a 2K texture map, so that's hardly anything. Rendered really, really quick. I've got Node Wrangler enabled, so I can hold Control, Shift, and T when I select my principled shader, and that brings up a browser that lets me select all my textures. And when I hit Set Up Principled Shader, it will connect them all up automatically for me. I think it looks all right, not too bad. I think it actually looks better in sunlight there than it does from how it eventually looks when I put a darker HDRI in and then put little kind of lights scattered all over it. But there you go. My idea was, again, it would look a bit grimdark, look a bit sort of nighttime, and there'd be little pools of light kind of going on. Trying to find an angle here using the walk navigation in Blender on my camera, and then going into my camera and changing the focal length. Have a smaller focal length, gives you a wider angle view. I'm going to position the camera a little bit further down, desperately trying to make this thing look bigger than it actually is. And in the camera, you can go to the viewport display and change the passport setting so that it sort of darkens off the border. And then I create another viewport with another 3D view. I tend to like to work like this personally, so I can always see my camera, and then I've got another 3D view where I can move around in and position my lights and my objects. So I start off with an area light, make it a rectangle, and then sort of scale it into a kind of strip light. I'm going to put that over the door. It's a very cliched sci-fi kind of way of looking at stuff. Automatically gives you that look. Cycles is a really, really fast renderer now. Blender version 3 has Cycles X, and if it takes advantage of your GPU, and I've got a really modest GPU, to be honest, but it means that I get, if not Octane style speeds, then still pretty respectable speeds. Octane is another sort of standalone renderer, or a renderer that you can actually plug into Blender, and that's, I think, one of the fastest ones going. But Cycles X serves the purpose perfectly well. So I'm making these lights a sort of slightly sickly fluorescent green, and I'm using another area light, and this is going to be like a bunch of little mini sort of recessed spotlights. I guess giving it that vaguely Blade Runner-y kind of look. And I'm fiddling around with the spread of this area light, which makes it behave a little bit more like a spotlight. I tend to kind of like using area lights when I can. I just find that they give the nicest kind of light. One of my colleagues, well, a couple of my colleagues are saying, do some kind of tutorial properly on lighting, and I should do. But yeah, I do like using area lights a lot. Not that I don't use spotlights or point lights, but area lights for me give me the best kind of look most of the time. The most control over the softness of lights. When I made those extra little lights, those little spotlights, instead of duplicating them using Shift D, I used Alt D, and that creates an instance of the light, which is really useful, which means then if I want to, I can just change the values and the color of one of the lights, and it will propagate through to all of the other lights And that can save a lot of time if you're doing one of these kind of buildings that has a lot of little light sources dotted all over it. Not that you really see those little lights I've just created on the other side of the building. You don't really notice them again. It was weird. It felt like a little bit of time pressure kind of going on here. Whenever I'm recording a tutorial, even though I know that I don't necessarily have to keep it, there's nothing forcing me from publishing the tutorial, I do get this strange sense of pressure, and so I end up rushing this a little bit too much. What I should do is I should just switch OBS on and try and forget that I've got it switched on. That way I wouldn't be stressing about it. So what I want to do, I'm going to end up sounding like every YouTuber. What you're going to want to do is you want to go to File, Import. What I want to do here is change up. So I've got these kind of sickly green fluorescent lights on the door and my little spotlights, and I want to make a sort of sense of a little window control area here. And to break up the monotony of always having the same color lights, I'm going to use a contrasting color. So I've got this kind of cool sickly green, so I'm going to go for a warmer tungsten light kind of color for the inside here. Done with the hope, that it just provides a little bit of interest. Now I'm making a large box that encompasses the entire scene, and I freeze the scale and I give it the principled volume shader. And initially, it's very foggy and misty. You tend to need very, very low values for density, and by default, the absorption color as black will make your scene very, very dark. So you might want to put that absorption color up to white to make it not so dark. And then I'm switching transparent on in the render settings so that I don't see the HDRI. And if I was to save that out now as a PNG, I would get an alpha channel. Finally, the final thing I'm doing now is creating basically very, very hacky windows to go over that area with the warmer tungsten lighting. Just a cube that's scaled and positioned into place. Nothing fancier than that. And the thing that I do that might be considered a tad fancy though is on the shader of this glass box is that I add a little bit of roughness. Actually, I add quite a lot of roughness to the glass. This is going to make the glass feel, and well, it's going to make it feel. It's going to make it look a little bit more like frosted kind of glass. In some ways, hiding the fact that there is nothing proper behind it. That it's just a sort of, there's no detail. It's just some orangey lights in the geometry. In Photoshop, I would probably find some photo and stick that behind there. And there we kind of are. That's the 3D aspect of it. Hope some of that helped. Hope the recording worked, because I've got a sore throat and I don't want to do this again. Anyway, bye-bye for now.